Hello everyone. So we know that membrane fluidity simply means how easily lipid molecules can move within the membrane, and it's not a fixed property. It depends upon several factors. So in this lecture we will be studying about different factors affecting this membrane's fluidity. So let's begin. Okay, so the first factor is fatty acid saturation. So, if a lipid molecule contains unsaturated fatty acid, then in that case, due to the presence of cis double bond, there is a kink present in one of the fatty acid tail, and this kink it prevents the tight packing of the lipid molecules and thereby increasing the fluidity of the membrane. While if lipid molecules containing saturated fatty acid tails, then the tails are like straight chains and they are very close to each other, tightly packed. So thereby decreasing the fluidity of the membrane. So more the lipid molecules containing unsaturated fatty acid tails, more is the fluidity, and more the lipid molecules containing saturated fatty acid tail, it less is the fluidity of the membrane. So the second factor is the acyl chain length or the fatty acid tail length. So if a lipid molecule contains shorter fatty acid tail, then in that case the interaction between the adjacent tails are less, and with less interaction it results in loose packing and thereby increasing the membrane's fluidity. But if lipid molecules contain a larger tail length, in that case the interaction between adjacent tails are high, so that leads to tight packing of the lipid molecules and decreasing the fluidity of the membrane. So shorter the tail length, high is the fluidity, and if a lipid molecule contains larger tail length, then less is the fluidity of the membrane. And next, the third factor is the temperature. So as we know that on increasing temperature, the kinetic energy of the fatty acid tail increases, so they move more rapidly, and their rapid movement leads to high fluidity of the membrane. While at low temperature, these fatty acid tails they move very less, and they lead to tight packing, and that tight packing results in decrease in the fluidity of the membrane. So high the temperature, high is the fluidity of the membrane. Less the temperature, lower the temperature, lower is the fluidity of the membrane. So the next factor to understand is presence of cholesterol. So cholesterol acts as a buffer in maintaining the membrane's fluidity. So at high temperature, when the membrane is highly fluid, in that case, presence of cholesterol between these fatty acid tails, it restricts the motion of these tails and thereby reducing the fluidity of the membrane. While at low temperature, when the membrane is rigid and the fatty acid tails are tightly packed, in that case the presence of cholesterol it prevents the tight packing of these fatty acid tails, so thereby increasing the fluidity of the membrane. So in this manner, cholesterol helps to maintain the membrane's fluidity at a stable range. So these are the different factors on which membrane fluidity depends. Now the next important thing to understand is why fluidity matters, or is it really that important? So let us understand that. So imagine a fact that a cell membrane is rigid in nature. So if a membrane is rigid in nature, then think about it. How can a cell perform processes like endocytosis or exocytosis? Because for these processes to occur, a membrane has to bend and curve, and it requires fusion of membranes, which is not possible with this rigid nature of the cell membrane. So that is why the fluidity of membrane allows vesicle budding and fusion, which is essential for trafficking of hormones, nutrients, and neurotransmitters in the cell. Similarly, certain membrane proteins like ion channels, receptors, signaling proteins, they need to laterally move in the membrane. in order to cluster in response to an extracellular signal. So if a membrane is rigid, then these signaling processes would be highly disrupted. So that is why this fluidity is essential for signaling, transport, and enzymatic activity of these membrane proteins. So thereby this fluidity is very important property of cell membrane, which has to be maintained in a balanced state for proper cellular functioning. So, this was all about today's lecture, where we learned about different factors affecting membrane's fluidity and why this fluidity is such an important property of cell membrane. So, if you have any doubts regarding the topic, you can drop it down in the comment section. I'll be happy to clear that. And thank you for watching, and see you soon in the next video.